I'd like to begin in Romans, the first chapter. This has to do with, of course, Paul is dealing with what he had experienced or was experiencing in that ancient world and the world before him, but it also applies to us today, and I think it's important to consider as we approach the Passover season and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because it has everything to do with the nature of this world, what we see going on around us, and it has to do especially with the question of by what standard do we determine what is right and what is wrong? Because the world gives us one standard. Even the professing Christian world gives us a standard. It says it's the Bible, but not all of the Bible. It's part of the Bible. And then I have to ask the question, okay, by what standard do you determine which part of the Bible we use and which part we do not use? And the answer, of course, is you are your own standard, and your standard is based on, guess what? Your desires. You read in Scripture, I'm sure, the expression, their God is their belly, and that's the truth. That's what the people's God, people who think in those terms, I could say, their God is their belly. That means simply that the God that they worship, they define Him, they determine His standards on the basis of their internal desires, their belly, as it were. So I'd like to look at this verse, beginning with this passage in Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18. Paul says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." That means that they know the truth, or they have some knowledge of the truth, and yet what they know, they suppress it. And he tells us a little later in this why they suppress it. He says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them." It's not hidden away. They really know it. There's a witness, and he's going to talk about that. It is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Now, how has God shown it? Well, look at what it says, verse 20. "For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived," not partly perceived, not in a shadowy form necessarily, but clearly perceived. And he says this, "ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made." In other words, what Paul is saying here is that you can look at creation itself, and you can see the will of the Creator expressed in creation. Now, this is going to be especially important in light of things we see going on in the world today, things going on right here in our own country, things going on in our communities around us, things in the media and so forth. But it's especially pertinent, and it's a warning to us. It's a reminder to us that we have to come out of the world, that we have to determine what is right, what is wrong, by a very different standard than the standards the world goes by. So he says, Paul tells us that these things were known, they were clearly known to these people who have now suppressed the truth. They've covered it up, they've lied about it. And he says that it can be known in the things that have been made, and he says, so they are without excuse. So what I would like to do is go back to the creation narrative itself, and I want us to see exactly what the Apostle Paul has in mind, because you're going to see when we come back to Romans 1 that Paul actually refers to the creation narrative and the truth that is revealed, the will of God as expressed in the divine acts of God in the creation narrative, and they're pertinent to, they're relative to every generation of human beings, including our generation today. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 1 and see what this says about the created order, which is what the Apostle Paul has in mind, and what we can learn from it. In Genesis chapter 1, and I'm going to cut across a lot of material here. We begin with God creating the heavens and the earth. They talk about the days of creation, the first 6 days, how He created, He brought forth the land. He separated the waters, brought out the land, and created the sky and the expanse in the heavens and all of these things. Then He put the creatures on the earth, the four-footed beasts, the beasts of the field, the creeping things, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, all of these things, each after its own kind, He created and placed here. And so after He did this, then we're coming down to the sixth day now. And we read here in verse 26, then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." This means the creature He's about to make, He's about to form and fashion and put in a particular place on this earth, is different from all the other creatures because He is going to bear the image and likeness of God. In some way He's going to resemble God. And because of His resemblance to God and His therefore ability to relate to God like no other creature can, He's going to be given special responsibilities and He's going to be held accountable for His actions because He's going to be given free will. God is free. That's one way in which we're in the image and after the likeness of God. We're free. God is free. We have intellect. So does God. We have the power of reason, as does God. So we're unlike any other creature that God made. Mankind is unlike any other creature in that we bear the image and the likeness of God. So it goes on to say, "And let them," meaning the male and the female and all that come forth from them, "have dominion over the fish of the sea," the things He's just talked about in the previous creation days, "over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man, this is Adam, referring to the kind, in His own image, in the image of God He created him, male and female He created them. Now, that's very important because this has to do with the creation order. And we begin reading right here. This begins in the history of human beings and God's dealing with human beings. This begins to reveal the will of God and thus set the standards by which we are to conduct ourselves. So male and female, He created them. This is the creation order. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion." Very important. Have dominion over the sea of over the sea, or the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed," and so on. That's as far as we need to go with that. But the point is here that God created man in His own image and after His own likeness, meaning He has intelligence and will, means that He is creative, unlike all the other creatures that God had placed on the earth. It means that He comprehends things that they don't comprehend. Those of you who have dogs and cats and pets, you know that they do not comprehend things such as justice or mercy or morality. I never had a dog that had comprehended morality. It seems that they always get in front of the neighbors or the visitors before they express their most what would appear to be immoral behaviors, but they're not moral creatures. They don't understand morality, do they? They don't have a comprehension of justice and mercy. They operate according to instinct, and they know what to do to get fed and to get rubbed and all of those things, but they do not have the comprehensions that we have. They cannot comprehend like justice, mercy, morality. They don't have a conscience. They can be conditioned. They may appear to have a conscience and feel all guilty. But that's because they know they're about to hear from you when they've torn up something. You know how that goes. But they don't have a conscience. But we do. We do have a conscience, don't we? And we have an inborn sense of morality. That is a part of the image and the likeness of God. That's definitely a part of it. But the problem is that once man fell into sin, once rebellion occurred, and now is outside the realm of God's sphere of influence to a great degree, now then that image has become distorted. And now then the conscience that we have has become distorted. And our conscience now, we begin to think in terms of right and wrong, and still a lot of it is there. You look around the nations of this world, the primitive tribes, even before the missionaries got to them, and many of them, you see, had a comprehension of things that we recognize as biblical morality. They understood justice, they understood mercy, and they had laws very similar to the laws you see in the Old Testament. And not because that some missionary came and taught them, but because their conscience gave them this information. This is what Paul talks about, as we shall see in Romans chapter 1. But that conscience becomes distorted over time because of the sinfulness of the world in which we live, because the standard has become something different from God's standard as set forth and revealed in Holy Scripture. So the conscience has become distorted, and we cannot rely on it. So what we need to do, of course, is mold our conscience according to the revelation of God, and not the other way around. Not judge God on the basis of what our conscience dictates, or what our sense of right and wrong dictates. When we look at God pouring out His judgments upon nations, we don't need to be judging Him and say, that's not justice. Well, how dare He do that to those poor Sodomites? Or how dare He do that to other nations, to the Babylonians, or to Israel? Look what He did to His own people, Israel. He scattered them. They were under horrible curse. Why, God shouldn't have done that. That shows you that's not a God worthy of my worship. So you're the one now who dictates what justice is. You're the one who has a standard that you judge God by, rather than accepting God's standard and letting Him judge you and mold your conscience and your understanding and your comprehension of what is right and what is wrong. That's why we have a law. God has given us a law, and that law is absolute, and it is universal. It applies to all places and all times, and it should be molding and shaping our conscience, the way we see the world, our worldview. And so that is our standard. So I ask the question, by what standard? By what standard do we live our lives? Do we conduct ourselves? Do we view the world around us? By what standard do we form our worldview and allow our consciences to be formed? So this is what we find here. We find that distortion did occur when man left the garden, when man fell out of favor with God because of his sinful activities, because he disobeyed, because he rebelled. But in this account, we see here the created order. This is what the Apostle Paul was referring to, the creation order. First, God gave man dominion. You know, the truth is, God alone has dominion. And as you read the first several verses, the whole chapter of Genesis 1 and into Genesis 2, you see God exercising dominion. He's bringing order out of chaos. That's what it means when it says the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God begins to speak. Things begin to happen. He's bringing order out of chaos. He is exercising dominion over His creation, for indeed it is His creation. It doesn't belong to the gods. It belongs to God, the one God. And so He is bringing order out of chaos. He is exercising dominion, and He alone has ultimately dominion over all things, over all principalities and power. There are other dominions, but they're not dominions when it comes to Him, because He has dominion over all. He's above all. And so therefore, it is His right to share that dominion with whomsoever He will. And guess who He shares it with? This creature that bears His image and His likeness. He gives him divine prerogatives. He says, you now will exercise dominion. You will have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the creeping things, and over the four-footed beasts and the beasts of the field, and so on and so on. You will have dominion over all these things and over the entire earth. I give you dominion. And you see Adam exercising that dominion when he names the animals, because that's God's prerogative. Those are the animals He made. He names them. And yet He tells Adam, you name them. And whatever name you give them, that's what they'll be. So here Adam is acting as God's co-regent, because he bears the image and likeness of God. And when I say Adam, I'm including Adam and Eve. So they bear the image and the likeness of God. They act as God's co-regent in the earth. And of course, they're designed in such a way as to be in communion with God. when communion is broken, then there's a God, as someone said, a God-shaped hole left in the human heart. And that's why you see so many religions in the world today. It's because everybody's trying to fill that void. So you have these religions, and the thing is, nature is fallen. The thing is, we've been cut off from God to a great extent. And the problem is, our image has been distorted, and so when we pursue God, or when the human beings pursue God, they come up with distorted versions of God and of His way, and so hence you have all these religions all over the world, and philosophies. Even when you look at some of the atheistic and evolutionary philosophies, you realize that really what they're trying to do is fill the void with some kind of purpose. Say, well, why are we here? And they try to come up with something, some kind of philosophy or some kind of religion to fill that void. But it cannot be filled until God is in communion with us. We're designed that way as His image bearers. And of course, we understand that one day the problem will be fixed. And we're longing for that day. We look forward to that day and hope that it comes and begins to occur very soon. So this is what we have. We have the created order. We have dominion being given to man. And man is defined as male and female. And of course, this is the origin of marriage. And you don't have to think about it very much to see that the male-female relationship is a complementary one. Each is designed to complement the other. I don't mean, heap praises on them, like you sure are pretty today and all that kind of thing. No, complementary, meaning that they match each other. And you see this emerge when Adam is told to name the animals, and he looks at all the animals, he names the animals, and it says that we were left with the statement that there is no companion for him. He knows, he recognizes, not that he was looking for a companion among the animals, but he recognizes that he's different from them because he's God's image bearer, and so it is then that God gives him the companion in life, one that is his own kind. Nothing else will work. So you have to have this degree of sameness, a certain degree of sameness. It has to be his own kind. He couldn't have fallen in love with a monkey. Hopefully he couldn't, or some kind of animal. That's just bizarre. And of course, it's perversion. It's not in the nature of things. Monkeys are attracted to monkeys. Animals, each according to his kind, they breed according to their kinds. You don't have companionships between humans and animals. But anyway, God gave him a companion, and you have to have, again, a certain degree of sameness. Has to be his own kind, and she was. And yet, there must also be the oppositeness, because she's very opposite him in certain ways. And we understand the male-female relationship and the union and all of that. And we see that very clearly just by looking around the world. That's in the nature of things. You have the male and female complementing each other in this one relationship to form this one unit. Now that is the creation order that Paul has in mind. Man having been given dominion, and man being composed of male and female. And he says the people are without excuse who distort all of that for their own lusts. That's what he's talking about in Romans 1. So now let's go back to Romans 1 and see that as it unfolds, and we'll see him actually refer in a certain way back to the creation narrative. Again, in the latter part of verse 20, he says, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, verse 21, although they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and, now get this, birds and animals and reptiles. Now wait a minute. God gave man dominion over these things, birds and animals and reptiles. And now here we find them making images of them and worshiping them. Do you see what the creation order is being violated seriously here? Indeed it is. Indeed it is. And that's not all. Paul, you're going to see that there's what is called an intertestament or an intertestamental echo, an intertextual echo. And what that means is that by reading what Paul says here, you'll see that he is deliberately referring back to the passage we just read out of Genesis. He's deliberately echoing what that says. And he's showing that there is a reversal in the created order. What was revealed since the creation of the world? What is evident in the world now? As we see humankind composed of male and female, and as we understand that humans are different from any other creatures, and this order now, things are getting out of order, and Paul points this out. Now let's consider what else he has to say here. It says, therefore God gave them up. That simply means that the judgment of God involves the removal of the divine restraints. You know, a society can go so far, or individuals even can go so far, to the point that it becomes evident that there's not going to be any repentance. And then to reach a certain point, and we know, according to Scripture, God does restrain evil through various agents, sometimes angelic agents, sometimes human government agents. He uses these things to restrain evil in the world. But when people go so far, when nations go so far, or individuals go so far down the road of corruption, then there comes a time when God will remove those restraints. So, okay, that's your choice. Go for it. Just remove the restraints and let you have your way. And that is an aspect of divine judgment, really. That's what he's talking about here when he says God gave them up. So this is an aspect of divine judgment. He gives them up, gives them over to dishonorable passions. Now get this, for their women exchange natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And men likewise give up natural relations with women and were consumed with passions for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. Now, I don't know if you've ever read any of the LGBTQ, whatever else in the alphabet and numbers, whatever else to add to that. If you've ever read any of their apologists who are defending their movement and saying that evangelicals and Bible-thumping fundamentalists like me, like they would consider me, don't understand this text. And they say we must consider the context, the broader context of the world in which the Apostle Paul lived. And in part I agree with what they're saying, but not altogether. And you'll see in a few moments what I mean. But what they say is, in Paul's world, there were idols, temples all over the place. Pagan idolatry was practiced throughout the various cities. That, in fact, is why it was necessary to mention porneia, which refers to all kinds of sexual sins, in the Acts 15 conference when instruction was to be sent to the Gentiles, because this was so prevalent in that society. These kinds of sins were there. And they were practiced in connection with idols' temples. You had male temple prostitution. You had all kinds of other prostitution and different things like that going on. So they say Paul is not speaking about committed, monogamous, same-sex relationships here, because that was the world he lived in, and he would naturally associate these things he's just mentioned here with what was going on in connection with idolatry. And actually inside, in some cases, the idols' temples. And I would say, okay, yeah, Paul was familiar with that, and I agree. There was some horrible things going on in those days. And long before in the land of Canaan, things like that were going on. Maybe some bestiality here and there. Also maybe incest, all sorts of things, especially back in the land of Canaan, but here maybe as well. But they say when Paul is talking about these kinds of relationships he's just described, the passage we just read, that he has that context in mind. And I say, yeah, he does in some measure, because those are people who had exchanged the glory of God for something else. They were making images of animals, the things, the creatures over which men were supposed to have dominion, and actually bowing down before them, making them into gods. So yes, that is true in large measure. But you know, the Apostle Paul was also a very educated man. It becomes evident as you read through the book of Acts. We see him on Mars Hill discussing issues with the philosophers of Mars Hill that were there to talk about their different philosophies and so on. And he's able to communicate with them on their own terms because he understands them. He's even able to communicate with them by quoting the philosopher, or I should say the poets, the pagan poets that they would be familiar with. So he was very educated. He could probably speak in different languages, probably spoke Greek, probably spoke certainly Hebrew, Aramaic, maybe have been multilingual. At least he was able to communicate across those language barriers. And he had a good idea as a Roman citizen about what the world consisted of. He was an educated man. That means that Paul would have also been aware of things far beyond just the idols' temples. And what he would have been aware of was the fact that same-sex unions is not just a modern phenomenon. He would have known as such going on in the ancient world, because there was even in the Roman world, there was even a semi-legal relationship involving same-sex couples. It was semi-legal, like you see today. The debate was there, even in that world. And that kind of thing was going on. So, no, Paul had all of these in view. Not just what was going on in connection with idolatry, but also the Roman world in general, including these monogamous, committed, same-sex relationships. He had it all in view. And so what you see here, though, in Romans chapter 1, is an echo, an intertextual echo of Genesis 1. In Genesis 1, man is given dominion over the beasts and the fish and the birds and so on. Here, man bows down before them. There, you see God made them male and female. Here, you see male going for male, female for female. This is a breakdown of the creation order. And this is exactly what Paul has in mind, and he says they are without excuse. Now again, back to the main point that I began with, and that is that there is a standard for determining these things. There's a standard. It's called the law of God. And we do not decide what we like in the law of God. Some people might accuse us of that. You go through the law and pick out what you like and then throw out what you don't like. No, we don't. I don't do that at all. What I do, I go through the law of God. That includes not only the 10 Commandments, but other commandments there. And I strive to understand them in their proper context. And then I ask the question, how do they apply to me today? And I find that many of those things that seem kind of strange to me, odd laws, things I can't relate to because I live in a very different culture, but once I understand what they meant to that culture, then I can see the underlying principle and how it applies to me. So that's what I do with it. I don't go back there and say, well, I like this one, and this one, but this one, guess what? That doesn't fit my lusts, so I don't like it. I'm going to throw it out. So what I'd like to do now, in the time remaining, is go back to another passage. Another passage is in Leviticus 18, and this one too is said to be in the context of certain cultural features. There's certain that you have to consider the cultural context and the idolatry in particular that was going on in the land of Canaan to understand it, and that the writer, Moses, and whoever else contributed to it, does not have in view committed same-sex relationships. And I'm telling you, he absolutely does have all same-sex relationships in view when he mentions that subject. And all are condemned under the same umbrella. So let's look at what he says in Leviticus 18. First of all, let me present the argument as it is presented by LGBT apologists. And they say, well, look at the context. Look at verse 3. It says, you shall not do as they do. I'll start with verse 1. It says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they, that's the Canaanites, do in the land of Egypt, they do in the land of Egypt, where they came from, where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. So you have a lot of abominations going on in Egypt. Of course, they lived there and they knew about them. In fact, when they got out into the wilderness, unfortunately, they brought too much Egypt with them. You find them making an idol right away. But in any case, he says, you shall not do as they did in Egypt, and you're not to do like they do in the land of Canaan. He says, you shall not walk in their statutes. You shall not govern your lives by their standards. You shall follow my standards, my rules, and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. And then he goes into a list of, these are sexual sins. He says, none of you shall approach any one of his close relatives to uncovered nakedness. I am the Lord. I said, well, that's the kind of things that were going on in the idols' temples. And the reason we know he's talking about idolatry and things connected with idolatry is because what he says over verse 21. Right in the midst of all this discussion, he says, you shall not give any of your children to offer them to Moloch and to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. These people would actually offer to a fake god called Moloch their children, which means he had this big pot belly, and they would bring the fire very hot, make a very hot fire, and offer their small children in there. Watch them burn to death in order to appease this god. And of course we're told here, so see, this is all about idolatry. It's all about idolatry. And so these other sins were things that were in connection with idolatry. And I would say, yeah, they were, but not exclusively. Are we to think that these kinds of sins were not going on outside of the context of idolatry as well? Of course they were. They were. And you see it reflected in the account. And the reason I know that these are universal laws and not something just for that time and that period and only restricted to them, have nothing to do with us today, is because God says that these people that I'm driving out before you, the Canaanites, said He's driving them out because they have corrupted themselves with all of these things. They've defiled the land, and therefore I drive them out. And he's saying, don't you do what they did, the same things. Don't you take up their practices, or I'll drive you out too. So this is a universal law. It was in force before Israel got there. In fact, God told Abraham that their iniquity had not yet reached its pinnacle, so he would not drive them out until it did. And finally it has. And listen, things were far worse there than you might read just looking at the surface of this text and relating to your experience in life. You think, well, these are bad enough, these are terrible things. But no, what was happening in the land of Canaan was the idolatrous practice, and all of these things that are named right here were going on. It was pretty much a repeat of Sodom and Gomorrah in many ways. But in any case, it was the corruption, the evil that was in the land was just, well, it was, as we shall see, it was befitting the judgment of God. And the judgment of God befell them. This time he didn't send fire from heaven, but he used Israel to bring about that judgment, to drive the people out of the land. Of course, Israel had its own problems then, because they didn't obey God very well, very many times at least. But back to verse 6, he says, none of you shall approach anyone of close, talking about incest here. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. And it tells you why. It's not because these are things they do in the idols' temples. So she is your mother. That's why you don't. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. This is why. Not because, it's connected with idolatry. No, this in itself is an abomination. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, whether brought up in the family or in another home. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter, of your daughter's daughter. For their, and here's why, their nakedness is your own nakedness. There's too much sameness here. Do you see that? Too much sameness. Just like you have in a same-sex relationship, too much sameness. You know, really what a same-sex relationship amounts to is you don't have enough oppositeness. It takes that oppositeness, if that's a word, to complete the unit. You know, a man and his wife, they have to have this oppositeness to attract. You know, if you have too much sameness, then you have corruption there. You got to have the oppositeness to complete, to balance out and complete the unit. That's just the fact of life. That's the way it is. Here in incestuous relationships, you have too much sameness. So it should not be. That's what he's saying here. He goes on to say, verse 11, you shall not uncover nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, brought up in your father's family, since she is your sister. That's why, since she is your sister. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. She is your father's relative. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, for she is your mother's relative. The answer, the why is right there in the text. It's not just because it's associated with idolatry or the worship of Moloch. It's because these things in and of themselves are sinful. And he says you're not to do these things. You're not to uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. That is, you shall not approach his wife. She is your aunt. You almost hear it for crying out loud in there. She is your aunt. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife, for crying out loud. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is your brother's nakedness. It belongs to him, not you. You shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman, of her daughter, and so on and so forth. It goes on. It says, well, I'll just read that one. It says, you shall not take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover their nakedness. They are relatives. It is depravity. Do you get the point? These things in and of themselves, not just because they're associated with idolatry, are depravity. They're sinful. Down in verse 20, and you shall not lie sexually with your neighbor's wife, and so make yourself unclean with her. Everybody agrees with that one. Everybody, LGBT, whoever it is, everybody agrees with that one. And then he goes on to say, and you shall not give to any of your children to offer them to Moloch and to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Yeah, that's in there for sure. It's right in the midst of all this. It certainly may establish a connection. There's no question about that. But these things in and of and by themselves, like adultery that's just been named right here, that's one of the 10 commandments. It is an abomination. It's a sin against God. And he condemns it right here. That's the standard. Now then, in verse 23, he says this, and this is the one, we throw this one out. We throw this one out. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. That only means well, when you have a situation where say a slave owner is taking his slave in that way against his slave's will. It's not talking about monogamous, loving, committed relationships. That's what we're told. Well, that's what we're told. But I want you to notice carefully what the text says. It says, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. Notice that part, as with a woman. As with a woman. You know what that presupposes? As a man would normally, a husband would naturally do with his wife. It's not talking about raping a woman, for sure. You shall not lie with a male as a man would normally be expected to lie with his wife. That's what it's saying. Yes, it does pertain to monogamous, committed relationships, same-sex relationships. It does. And it says it's an abomination if anybody does this. Does it say abomination? Yeah, it does. It says it's an abomination. It says it right here in the text. It's an abomination. And he goes on to condemn bestiality or bestiality and other such things. And then he says in verse 24, do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things. Now don't read When it's in the context of the idol's temple. No. Or in the context of this blatant, ugly, despicable idolatry. For by all these things that he's just named, the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean. In other words, those are universal laws. They're not just for Israel. They apply to them as well. To these Gentiles, these uncircumcised people that God is driving out from before them. And the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. So these are universal laws. They apply to every place and in every time, and they're not confined only to a particular cultural set of situations involving idolatry and related things. No, this is universal, and it applies to our day today as well. So I ask you, and we could go on to so many of the other laws, and of course the argument, the comeback is, well, what about this law over here? You don't observe that one, do you? What about these laws about mixing fabrics? Hey, you wear mixed fabrics, don't you? Yeah, I do. You know what? It has nothing to do with that law. You have these three laws right there together. You don't plow in the field with an ox and a donkey together. Now, why is that? It doesn't tell you why. It just says you don't do that. Also, you don't wear mixed garment or mixed fabrics. It names the fabrics, by the way, and those are not the fabrics we wear usually. And the other is you don't plant different kinds of seed in the same field. Doesn't mean a garden. I think what it means is sowing different seed together. Now, there might be some practical purpose for each of those. There might be some practical purpose. For example, if you're mixing different kinds of fabrics, you could come up with an inferior product, and if you're selling it as something it's not, then you see the problem with that. That's one possibility. Or it may be that these different practices were magical rites in pagan cultures, and he's saying don't imitate them. That's a possibility. We're not really sure about it, but there's another possibility, and I would say this, even though there might be some practical reason for those mixture laws, I would say that this is the bottom line right here. And that is that God gave to Israel, remember, this was a stiff-necked, hard-hearted people who had shown God over and over and over that they were not inclined to keep His commandments and statutes and judgments. So He gave them regulations and rules in order to keep them mindful of certain things. And what was the one thing in particular He wanted to keep them mindful of? That they were separate from the nations. And why did He separate them from the nations? Was it to maintain racial purity? No, that had nothing to do with it. To keep them out of the practices of the nations. That's why. And so these laws concerning mixing garments and having two different animals in the field, the ox and the donkey and so on, and sowing two different kinds of seed in the field, these were, I would say, and looking at how God dealt with Israel and what kind of people He was dealing with, these served as parables and would remind them always that they were called to be a separate people and that they were not to mix with the nations as far as religious practice was concerned. These are parable laws. And guess what? They still apply today. No, it doesn't matter what kind of garments you wear. And I don't care if you hook up your mule and your cow and you go out and plow your garden with it, you're not violating any of God's laws. But you are violating God's laws when you do what those laws are designed to remind Israel to prevent, to not do. That is to say, when you adopt the ways of this world, when you adopt their standard, the world's standard of behavior, and you abandon God's standards. There is no other standard. If you're a Christian, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, if you follow Him, then you believe this book contains the inspired Word, the revelation of God, and this alone is your primary standard. Not to say you can't use reason and logic and so on in dealing with various things in life, but this is your foundational standard right here. God's law, the commandments of God. these laws He gave to Israel, yeah, they still are pertinent to us today. Yeah, there are many things in there. You run across things that we can't readily relate to. Not sure what they're talking about. But when you study them out carefully, you see a consistent story here. You see it all is consistently related to the two great commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the 10 commandments, which are 10 moral categories encapsulating or describing these two great commandments. That's what it comes down to. So all of it is about that. This is the standard. No other standard. So as you face the world, as you move through life from day to day, you and with your children, and all that everyone you're responsible for, always be mindful that God has called you out of this world. Always be mindful that He has given you a standard by which you are to live. And that standard is not the standards you see in the world. It's the standard you find revealed in this Word, in this book, the Holy Bible, the Scripture. And a standard you find especially magnified in the life and ministry and the death and resurrection and the teachings of Jesus Christ our Lord.